Hey guys, welcome back to The Sleepless Historian. Tonight, we're going somewhere uncomfortable. So dim the lights, get under your blanket, and prepare yourself for a soft, slow walk through humanity's most disturbing little hobby, inventing new and exciting ways to make people regret being alive. Now, before we start, no, I'm not here to give you a horror show. You can unclench. This isn't going to be one of those screaming medieval chamber stories. We're keeping it slow, steady, and just mildly existential. Think of this as a bedtime story about pain, told with the calmness of a late-night history nerd who's seen too many museum diagrams. So let's drift back to a time when Europe was cold, damp, and probably smelled like old beer and fear. The medieval age, when the church ruled your soul, monarchs ruled your body, and both occasionally shared custody of your misery. Torture wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was a tool for confession, justice, or, my personal favorite medieval excuse, moral purification. Because apparently, nothing says, let's save your soul, like being stretched across a wooden frame until your joints say the bye. Let's start gentle. We'll ease into the nightmare with something traditional. The rack, the Stretch Armstrong of medieval justice. Ah yes, the rack. Possibly the most famous and least misunderstood piece of medieval gym equipment. It was simple, brutal, and painfully efficient, literally. Imagine a long wooden table with rollers at both ends, ropes tied to your wrists and ankles. The torturer turns the crank, and your body slowly elongates. Tendons stretch, ligaments snap, bones dislocate, and at some point, you realize that your shoulders have probably moved to a postal code they were never meant to visit. Now, the thing about the rack is, it wasn't usually about killing people, it was about persuasion. We just want the truth, they'd say, as they turn the handle another quarter rotation. Henry VIII was quite fond of this one, because of course he was. The man had a hobby of breaking both marriages and bodies with equal enthusiasm. The rack was used all over Europe, but the English really embraced it. They even had a cute name for it, the Duke of Exeter's daughter, which is honestly the most disturbingly adorable name for a device that could disassemble you like a Lego man. Let's float over to another dark little corner, because medieval Europe had options. The Iron Maiden, the hot topic of historical torture. Okay, first, let's get something out of the way. The Iron Maiden, the big spiky coffin you've probably seen in every bad medieval movie, probably didn't actually exist during the Middle Ages. Sorry to ruin your nightmare fuel. The idea of the Iron Maiden was more of an 18th or 19th century invention, a sort of greatest hits remix of older devices. Someone looked at a sarcophagus, thought, what if we add spikes and trauma, and boom, a legend was born. Still, the concept fits medieval energy so perfectly that it's almost believable. You'd be locked inside, arms folded, standing upright, while dozens of iron spikes pressed just deep enough to pierce the skin without killing you immediately. You wouldn't bleed out, you'd just exist in a metal womb of regret. And if that's not the perfect metaphor for medieval justice, I don't know what is. Let's gently glide to something a bit more creative. The Judas cradle, because sitting down shouldn't be this complicated. Here's where things get uncomfortable in ways that make even the rack seem like yoga. The Judas cradle was a tall wooden pyramid, like a stool from the worst corner of hell. The victim would be hoisted up and slowly lowered onto the pointed tip. The idea was that the sharp apex would press into a very personal area, you can imagine which, causing excruciating pain, all while gravity and time did the rest. To enhance the process, executioners would sometimes add weights to the victim's feet, or gently rock them, like a horrifying version of a baby swing. Because why not double down on sadism when you're already this far gone? This particular device was meant to humiliate as much as it was to torture. It wasn't just about pain, it was about shame. You were naked, exposed, and impaled in front of a crowd that was probably enjoying their bread and cheese as they watched. Medieval Europe had different entertainment standards. Let's drift over to Italy, where things got theatrical. The Pear of Anguish, because someone looked at a fruit and thought, weaponize it. The Pear of Anguish is one of those objects that proves the medieval mind had too much time and too little empathy. It was a metal device shaped like a pear, with petals that could expand outward when you turned a screw. The torturer would insert it into, well, one of several orifices depending on the alleged crime, and slowly twist. As the petals opened, tissue tore, bones cracked, and you can fill in the rest. Sometimes it was called the choke pear, which somehow makes it sound even worse. There's debate over whether it was really used or if it's just another Renaissance myth with good branding. But even as an idea, it tells you everything you need to know about the creativity of cruelty in the so-called Age of Faith. Let's take a slow breath, maybe unclench a little, because the next one involves cooking. The brazen bull, when the Greeks got a little too artsy with murder. Before medieval Europe perfected misery, ancient Greece had already submitted its prototype, the brazen bull. It was a hollow bronze statue of a bull large enough to fit a person inside. A fire was lit underneath, heating the metal until it glowed. The victim roasted alive inside, while the bull's head was engineered so that the screams echoed out as if the bull itself were bellowing. Dark? Absolutely. Ingenious in a horrifying way? Also yes. The story goes that the inventor of the bull, a man named Perillus, proudly presented his creation to the tyrant Phalaris of Agrigentum. Phalaris was intrigued. He asked for a demonstration. And, because history loves irony, Perillus became the first test subject. Moral of the story? If you ever invent a torture device for a tyrant, don't offer a live demo. The wheel. Spinning, but make it fatal. If you've ever looked at a cartwheel and thought, that looks like a great surface for a human spine, congratulations! You share creative instincts with medieval executioners. The wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, was used across Europe for centuries. The condemned would be tied to the wheel while the executioner methodically broke their limbs with an iron bar. Each blow was precise, rhythmic, slow enough to prolong consciousness, fast enough to ensure despair. Sometimes they were left displayed afterward, a grim warning to anyone thinking of stealing bread, blaspheming, or, existing incorrectly. In France, they even had a saying, to be broken on the wheel became synonymous with total ruin. It was the medieval version of getting cancelled, except permanent. The chair of torture, medieval interior design at its worst. Now, imagine a regular chair, but make it metal, cover it in spikes, and heat it over a fire. Voila! The chair of torture. Victims were strapped onto the chair, their skin punctured by hundreds of sharp points. Sometimes it was heated to add that extra flavor of agony. The spikes were strategically placed to puncture without immediately killing, just enough to make every breath a bad decision. Records suggest this device was particularly popular in Germany and Italy, which just goes to show the Renaissance gave us Michelangelo and this thing, balance, I suppose. The Scavenger's Daughter, a Tudor twist on human origami. England, 16th century. Enter Sir Leonard Scavington, Lieutenant of the Tower of London, and inventor of something no one asked for, the Scavenger's Daughter. While the rack stretched you apart, this one crushed you together. The device folded the body into a tight metal frame, head between knees, arms wrapped around legs, iron clamps locking everything in place. It forced blood from the nose and ears, sometimes bursting capillaries in the eyes. It was the inverse of the rack, which is almost poetic if you're into symmetry or cruelty. Henry VIII approved it, of course, because if there's one thing consistent about that man, it's his enthusiasm for creative misery. Let's pause here for a soft breath. We've covered stretching, crushing, impaling, heating, and roasting. And the scary part? We've barely scratched the surface. So, refill your tea, maybe light a candle, preferably not under a brass bowl, and let's float into part 2, where we'll explore even stranger, sadder, and more absurdly over-engineered torture devices that only a medieval mind could have dreamed up. Because, apparently, in the old days, innovation meant figuring out new shapes for suffering. Hey again, welcome back. Still here? Good. That means your morbid curiosity outweighs your need for emotional comfort. We're doing fine. Just keep breathing slowly, sip whatever you're drinking, and let's continue our quiet little stroll through medieval innovation at its most unnecessary. We left off with the scavenger's daughter, England's version of how small can we make a human being without killing them? Tonight, we'll shrink our scope, literally, because while some torture devices were massive architectural undertakings, others were small, portable, and intimate. The kind of thing you could pack for a road trip if your road trip involved interrogating heretics. Let's start with something deceptively tiny. The thumbscrew, because apparently fingers deserved their own torture device. If the rack was the king of medieval torture, the thumbscrew was the humble foot soldier. It was small, efficient, and terrifyingly simple. Imagine 2 metal plates joined by a screw. You'd place your thumb, or sometimes fingers, or even toes, between them, and then turn the screw. Slowly, patiently. Each twist brought the plates closer together, crushing the flesh, splitting the nail beds, cracking the bone. There was no blood, no spectacle, just the slow, quiet destruction of a small piece of you, which somehow feels more personal. It was a favorite among inquisitors, especially when they needed quick motivation without too much cleanup. You could carry it in your pocket, the portable pain accessory of the 15th century. They even used versions on hands, knees, and ankles, because why limit yourself to one body part when you could diversify your agony portfolio? And of course, there was a variation called the head crusher, which, yes, is exactly what it sounds like, a scaled-up version for your face. It pressed the head between 2 metal plates, forcing the jawbone into the skull. The eyes, well, they eventually had exit strategies. Not to worry, we're keeping this bedtime friendly, just historically honest. Let's drift to something more visual. Coffin torture, the original public humiliation package. So, picture this. You're dragged into the town square. There's a large human-shaped metal page waiting for you. You're placed inside, locked in, and left hanging from a post. Congratulations, you've just become the day's local attraction. That's coffin torture, also known as the gibbet. The cage was usually shaped roughly like a human outline, sometimes adjustable for size, and always too tight to sit or lie down. If you were lucky, you died of thirst in a few hours. If you weren't, you stayed there for days, while the crowd gawked, birds pecked, and nature recycled you. It wasn't always for torture per se. Sometimes it was punishment or post-execution display. They hang the bodies of criminals in these cages as warnings, slowly decomposing in public view. Because nothing says, "Don't steal bread," like your neighbors slowly turning into jerky above the market. In some regions, they left people in these cages alive until death claimed them. The public loved it. They'd toss scraps, insults, or prayers, depending on mood and moral superiority. A few of these gibbets still exist in museums today, rusted and hollow, like the iron ghosts of collective cruelty, which is poetic in a humans are terrible sort of way. Let's quietly leave that hanging, pun intended, and slide towards something more mechanical. The boot, because feet weren't just for walking. The boot was one of those devices that started as a simple idea and quickly spiraled into, oh no, they improved it. At its core, it was designed to crush the legs, slowly, methodically, and very publicly. The earliest versions were wooden or metal frames that encased the lower legs. Then, wedges were hammered between the frame and the flesh, driving the bone into powder. Over time, engineers, and I use that word with heavy sarcasm, developed variations. Some used screws instead of wedges. Others had spikes inside. The Scottish-Spanish boot version used heated iron, combining crushing and burning for that premium pain experience. And, of course, it was used during witch trials. Because when a woman in 1600 said, "I'm not a witch," the logical response was apparently to shatter her shins until she said, "Fine, I'm a witch, please stop." The boot wasn't about killing, it was about confession or breaking will. It worked. Bones could be reset, but trust in humanity? Not so much. Some chroniclers even noted that after a few rounds of the boot, prisoners often confessed to everything imaginable: heresy, sorcery, possibly inventing the plague, anything to make it stop. Let's hobble away from that and glide over to something uniquely uncomfortable: the Spanish donkey, because sitting wasn't supposed to hurt that much. The Spanish donkey, or as some sources call it, the wooden horse. It sounds whimsical, like a children's toy. Spoiler, it was not. Imagine a tall wooden beam shaped like an inverted V, with the top edge sharpened into a ridge. The victim would be stripped, hoisted up, and forced to sit astride it, legs hanging down, gravity doing its cruel little dance. To make things worse, and of course they did, weights were often tied to the ankles. The sharper the edge, the heavier the weights, the faster the suffering. Eventually, the pressure would split the body from below, slowly, painfully, inevitably. It's believed to have originated in Spain, hence the name, and spread throughout Europe during inquisitions and witch hunts. Apparently, someone saw a horse and thought, what if we removed the fun and added trauma? There's a reason some people say the Spanish Inquisition was less about faith and more about sadistic creativity. No one expected it, but everyone regretted it. The heretic's fork: minimalist design, maximum discomfort. Now, if the boot and the donkey were heavy and elaborate, the heretic's fork was pure medieval minimalism: a small metal rod with 2 prongs on each end. One end pressed under the chin, the other against the chest. It was strapped around the neck so you couldn't move or lower your head without stabbing yourself. No sleep, no rest, just eternal awareness. Victims wore it during repentance periods or while being interrogated. Some were forced to wear it while walking through town, a little portable reminder to keep your head up. It was simple, silent, and cruelly efficient, which, if we're being honest, is the perfect summary of medieval philosophy. Let's take another soft breath, because next up, we're getting weirder. The saw, when patience was a virtue, apparently. This one sounds brutal, but remember, we're still in bedtime tone, so we'll glide through it gently. The saw was exactly what it sounds like: a 2-person saw. The victim was usually suspended upside down, which kept blood in the brain and prolonged consciousness. Then the cutting began, slow, deliberate, and, well, you get the picture. The idea wasn't just pain, it was moral spectacle. Crowds watched. The executioners took their time. It was less about justice and more about theater. Ancient Persia, Rome, and later medieval Europe all had their own versions. The Romans loved this one for treason. The church occasionally used it for blasphemy, because nothing says love thy neighbor quite like a slow-motion anatomy lesson. Let's float away from that image, maybe towards something a little less final. The pillory and the stocks, when torture became a community event. Not every medieval punishment involved dismemberment. Some just required humiliation. The pillory, that wooden frame that locks your head and hands in place, was the medieval equivalent of social media. You'd stand in the town square while everyone publicly expressed their opinions about your life choices. People threw rotten food, insults, and occasionally rocks. Children were the worst offenders, because apparently bullying had no age limit. The stocks were similar, but for the feet. Some towns even added a sign describing your crime, because branding was important, even in the 1400s. It was public shaming, plain and simple. Painful, degrading, but survivable. Unless someone decided to throw something harder than bread. Compared to the donkey or the boot, the pillory was practically a day spa. But psychologically, it could ruin someone forever, which in a way made it just as effective. Let's settle here for a moment. We've journeyed through devices that stretched, crushed, pierced, and publicly embarrassed. And if you're wondering, no, this wasn't even considered barbaric by medieval standards. This was law, order, and occasionally entertainment. Humanity didn't just tolerate cruelty, it institutionalized it, packaged it, and displayed it with civic pride. In Part 3, we'll explore the bizarre hybrids, the torture machines that blended religious symbolism, medical curiosity, and pure madness. The Wheel of Thorns, the Drunkard's Cloak, the Iron Spider, and the dreaded Cat's Paw. So stay relaxed, stay morbidly curious, and maybe grateful that you're lying in bed, not on a sharp wooden beam somewhere in 15th century Spain. Sleep tight, we're just getting to the good stuff. Hey again, still awake? Or maybe pleasantly drifting somewhere between fascination and mild horror. Perfect. That's exactly where the Sleepless Historian likes you to be. Comfortable, curious, and just a little appalled by humanity's creativity. Tonight, we keep floating deeper into the medieval toolbox. We've stretched limbs, crushed bones, humiliated heretics, and broken a few spirits along the way. But what's next? Well, in this part, we enter the realm of hybrids, torture devices that weren't content with being simple. These were contraptions that blended art, punishment, and religious symbolism in ways that would make both Leonardo da Vinci and the devil raise an eyebrow. So, let's glide into the mechanical madness. The Wheel of Thorns, when the garden meets the guillotine. If you've ever admired a rose bush and thought, this could be deadlier, congratulations! You might have fit right in with the inventors of the Wheel of Thorns. The concept was a variation on the breaking wheel, that infamous contraption that turned human beings into pretzels for public enjoyment. But this one added a charming horticultural twist. Imagine a large wooden wheel, fitted not with ropes or spikes, but with rows of sharpened thorns, iron barbs, and sometimes even broken glass. The victim was strapped across the wheel and rotated slowly while the edges sliced, punctured, and, well, you get the picture. Occasionally, executioners would roll the wheel down a gentle slope for a bit of kinetic artistry, because why not combine gravity with brutality? Medieval Europe loved a good multitasking execution, and sometimes they planted the wheel vertically, like a macabre Ferris wheel of regret, displaying the writhing body for townsfolk to admire as a warning. "Obey your lord," the message said, "or you too might become this week's Godden feature." Symbolically, the thorns represented divine punishment. Sin was pain, and pain was cleansing. Which, if we're being real, sounds less like theology and more like a marketing pitch for sadism. Let's roll gently onward, quite literally, to something more ridiculous than painful. The Drunkard's Cloak, public humiliation with fashionable flair. Now, this one is less about blood, more about embarrassment. The Drunkard's Cloak was the perfect punishment for people who couldn't hold their ale, which in medieval Europe was everyone. It was essentially a wooden barrel with holes cut out for your head and arms. The drunkard, or any minor offender really, would be shoved inside, then paraded through the streets while the townsfolk laughed, jeered, and probably threw cabbage. It was heavy, awkward, and deeply humiliating. Some towns would even hang little signs around the barrel that said things like, "This man cannot govern his thirst." Medieval humor was about as subtle as a church bell at dawn. The punishment was most popular in England and Germany during the 16th and 17th centuries. In Nuremberg, they called it the Schandmantel, the cloak of shame. It was sometimes painted with garish designs or mock faces, because apparently, if you're going to humiliate someone, you might as well make it festive. Unlike most devices on our list, this one didn't kill or maim. It just made you wish the ground would open up and swallow you, which honestly is a whole different kind of suffering. You'd shuffle through town, sweating inside a beer barrel, while children pointing and old ladies crossed themselves. And yes, sometimes people fainted or suffocated inside from the heat and weight. Because even when medieval punishment tried to be funny, it still managed to be fatal. Let's stumble out of that barrel and head towards something spidery. The iron spider, because someone misunderstood catching flies. Ah, the iron spider, also known as the breast ripper. Yes, you heard that right. This was not an 8-legged pet. It was a metal-clawed instrument used primarily on women accused of adultery, blasphemy, or witchcraft, which, historically speaking, meant being a woman on the wrong day. The device looked like a spider, curved metal legs ending in hooks. It was heated red-hot, then applied to the flesh and ripped away. The result was as gruesome as it sounds, and yet disturbingly ritualistic. It was meant to purify through pain, a theme medieval Europe could not get enough of. Some versions were mounted on walls and used to tear flesh slowly while the victim was pulled forward. Others were handheld, compact, convenient, and favored by inquisitors who liked their cruelty artisanal. The church often justified this by saying it punished sins of the body on the body. Symbolic symmetry, they said. Sadistic efficiency, we'd say. And to think, this was considered righteous work. Sleep tight with that thought tonight. Let's crawl out of that web and move towards something claw-like, but slightly less specific. The cat's paw, the original medieval scratch tool. Don't let the name fool you. There were no cats involved, just the same level of curiosity and regret. The cat's paw, sometimes called the flesh rake, was a handheld iron claw with 4 or 5 sharp hooks. It was used to tear flesh from the bones, typically the back, arms, or legs. It didn't kill quickly. It just removed dignity one strip at a time. Sometimes the claw was attached to a long handle for distance work, useful if you didn't want to get blood on your robes. Other times, it was wielded up close, one inquisitor to one victim, in what you could generously call intimate torture. And yes, they often heated it first, because apparently medieval torturers thought of temperature as a seasoning. The cat's paw wasn't confined to dungeons either. It was used in public punishments and witch trials. Imagine a quiet town square, the gentle sound of church bells, and somewhere a man calmly raking someone's back like a grotesque violinist, all in the name of truth and salvation. The Drunkard's Cloak Revisited, the sequel no one wanted. Now, sometimes the cloak got creative upgrades. In certain towns, they added bells to the barrel so everyone could hear you coming. In others, they poured ale over your head just to drive the point home. Public humiliation was a form of social glue. It reminded everyone that sin had consequences and that community shame was the strongest leash of all. In a weird way, the drunkard's cloak was humane compared to most other punishments. It didn't mutilate, just mortified. It was psychological torture, before psychology had been invented. And really, isn't that so very medieval? The Wheel of Thorns Revisited, because spinning despair deserved a comeback. In later versions, the wheel evolved. Torturers began embedding nails, spikes, and bits of iron chain into the rim. Sometimes they would bind the condemned to the wheel, spin it, and strike it with clubs, a kind of grim carousel powered by screams. One 14th century chronicler noted that the body appeared as a garland of ruin. Poetic, horrifying, and exactly the kind of bedtime imagery you didn't ask for. And yet, this was entertainment. Whole towns turned out to watch, eating bread, gossiping, and cheering as though they were at a football match. The medieval world didn't separate justice from theater. They were the same thing, public proof that order had teeth. Let's take a long, slow breath together. We've met barrels, claws, and wheels, the full creative catalog of mankind's least redeeming era. And the common thread through all of them? Not rage, not vengeance, just bureaucracy. These things were designed, approved, and used officially, signed off by kings, priests, and judges who went home afterward and probably slept just fine. In Part 4, we'll drift toward the end of the medieval period, where torture started to go scientific. We'll meet the Judas chair, the torture mask, the Branks bridle, and the bizarre water ordeal. Less blood, more psychology. Because apparently, by the Renaissance, cruelty had evolved from breaking bodies to breaking minds. So stay tucked in, stay relaxed, and remember, if you ever think your job is stressful, at least it doesn't involve designing new ways to hurt people for the glory of God and crown. Hey again, night owls. Still awake? Of course you are, because apparently nothing helps you drift into dreamland like a relaxing tour through the quiet horrors of human creativity. Tonight, we're floating into the late medieval era, that charming period when torture got refined. Because apparently breaking bones was too mainstream, and humanity decided to innovate ways to break the mind instead. Gone were the days of brute iron and obvious suffering. Now came the age of humiliation, fear, and imagination. In a way, medieval Europe invented its own version of psychological warfare, centuries before anyone had heard of therapy or human rights. So, fluff your pillow, take a deep breath, and let's softly descend into this delicate art of civilized torment. The Judas chair. Comfortably uncomfortable. Our first stop is the Judas chair, which sounds like a biblical relic, but trust me, there was nothing holy about it. This chair was designed less for sitting and more for prolonged existential regret. Imagine an iron throne, not the one from Game of Thrones, but a far less glamorous version covered entirely in spikes. Every inch, the seat, the back, even the armrests, studded with little metal teeth. Prisoners were gently invited to sit, often naked, and then that was it. The executioner didn't even have to do much. The person's own body weight did the rest, slowly pressing their skin against the spikes. The real genius of it all? They didn't always kill you. Oh no, death would have been far too merciful. Sometimes you just sat there for hours or days, barely moving, barely bleeding, because the goal was to make sure you didn't die too quickly. It was pain with patience, the kind of suffering that whispered, not screamed. And medieval authorities absolutely loved it, because nothing said confess your crimes quite like a chair that turned relaxation into an act of agony. Let's drift along from this thorny throne to something a little more personal. The Branks bridle, the medieval muzzle for loudmouths. Next up is the Branks bridle, also known as the scold's bridle. And if that name already makes you uneasy, you're in the right emotional neighborhood. This was a charming little device popular in early modern Europe, mostly reserved for women accused of being, quote, too talkative, too gossipy, or my favorite, argumentative. In short, women who refused to shut up about the nonsense around them. The Branks bridle was a kind of iron cage that enclosed the head, like a bizarre birdcage mask, with a metal plate that slid into the mouth. Sometimes that plate had a spike on it, pressing into the tongue. So if the scold tried to talk, she'd stab herself from the inside. Very delicate, very civilized. Then they'd parade her through the town square for everyone to admire, because humiliation, of course, was the real point. pain was just the garnish. It's wild how much effort they put into silencing people when they could have just invented, say, noise-canceling headphones. But no, they chose iron, spikes, and public mockery. Because nothing screams moral society quite like torturing someone for having an opinion. Let's drift onward to another device that took the art of fear to a new level of theater. The torture mask, because suffering needed a face. The torture mask is exactly what it sounds like, a mask of metal worn by the accused that turned humiliation into performance art. These weren't ordinary masks, they were grotesque caricatures, molded into exaggerated faces of animals, demons, or fools. Each mask was personalized to mock the supposed crime. A liar might wear a mask shaped like a long-nosed devil. A thief might get one with donkey ears. And of course, these masks were heavy, clunky, and impossible to remove without assistance, because the goal was for the wearer to stew in discomfort and shame. Sometimes they attached bells, so the victim's every movement announced their presence, a literal walk of shame ringing through the streets. And since medieval people loved a good spectacle, townsfolk would jeer and laugh as the poor soul shuffled along. In a way, it was early social media, humiliation as entertainment. Only instead of comments and retweets, you got bruises and tetanus. The brilliance, if you can call it that, was in how it replaced physical pain with emotional theater. The person's body might heal, but their dignity, not so much. And that brings us to one of the oldest, simplest, and eerily spiritual forms of torment ever devised. The ordeal by water, justice by drowning guilt. Now, if you thought torture was about cruelty, wait till you meet divine logic. The water ordeal was a favorite among medieval courts who wanted to outsource judgment to God himself. The idea was disarmingly simple: throw the accused into a river. If they sank, they were innocent, because water, being pure, had accepted them. If they floated, they were guilty, because the water rejected their sinful soul. Of course, the innocent ones often drowned, but hey, at least they went to heaven, right? Justice served. This method was famously used in witch trials. Women suspected of witchcraft would be bound and dropped into a lake while onlookers prayed and waited to see what God decided. Spoiler alert, God apparently had terrible aim. Most either drowned or were pulled out only to be executed later anyway. It's one of those ideas that sounds ridiculous until you realize it was deadly serious to the people practicing it. And it tells you a lot about the medieval psyche, this deep obsession with purity, sin, and cosmic fairness, all wrapped up in a process that killed more innocents than it ever saved. Still, they considered it merciful. After all, they weren't torturing you, they were letting the divine do it for them. Very convenient, very pious, and very medieval. The quiet horror of refined pain. By this point, torture had gone from brute force to performance art. The body was no longer just something to crush, it was a stage for moral theater. Pain became symbolic, humiliation became holy. The Judas chair whispered lessons about patience. The Branks bridle punished the outspoken. The torture mask taught conformity. And the water ordeal reminded everyone that truth wasn't found in evidence, it was drowned in faith. Each of these devices tells a small, uncomfortable truth about the era, that people feared chaos so much they built pain into order, that obedience mattered more than life, that silence was safer than honesty. And that, perhaps, is the scariest part, how rational all this once seemed. But don't worry, our little bedtime history nightmare isn't over yet. In the next part, we'll float toward the truly artistic side of cruelty, when torture became a kind of innovation race among executioners. Because if you can't find meaning in misery, apparently you can still find craftsmanship. So take a slow breath, uncoil your brain, and drift softly into the next terrible invention. Hey again, Night Scholars. If you're still here, it means either you're deeply fascinated by medieval torture, or you've simply given up on sleep altogether. Either way, welcome back. Tonight, we glide into the next evolution of suffering, the age when executioners stopped being just brutes with axes and became craftsmen. Yes, this was the era when pain got blueprints. Because apparently, if you're going to destroy someone, you might as well make it technically impressive. The breaking wheel, the symphony of bones. Let's start with one of the classics, the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, though St. Catherine probably prefer not to be associated with it. Imagine a giant wooden wagon wheel laid horizontally. The condemned would be tied down, and then the executioner would begin the process. Methodical, striking the limbs one by one with an iron bar. The goal wasn't instant death. Oh no, that would be lazy. The goal was pattern. First the shins, then the thighs, the arms, and then the shoulders. Carefully, symmetrically, until the body looked less like a human and more like a tragic marionette. Sometimes the wheel itself was lifted vertically afterward, displaying the mangled body for public viewing, the medieval equivalent of a warning billboard. And here's the truly odd part. The wheel had fans. People actually attended these events, cheering or placing bets on how long the poor soul would stay conscious. It was community entertainment, the world's bleakest street fair. And the executioner? He was the star performer, praised for precision and endurance. It wasn't just killing, it was choreography. The Iron Maiden, a beautiful lie. Ah, yes, the Iron Maiden, one of the most famous torture devices in the world, and, ironically, one of the least real. That's right, despite its reputation, the Iron Maiden is mostly a 19th century myth. It never really existed in the Middle Ages. At least, not in the dramatic way people imagine it, with spikes inside and screaming victims slowly impaled behind a serene metal face. The concept seems to have been cobbled together later, combining features of coffins, spiked chests, and Renaissance imagination. But it feels medieval, doesn't it? It has that perfect blend of Gothic drama and claustrophobic horror. If it had existed, though, it would have been spectacularly efficient in psychological terms. The fear alone of being locked in a dark, spiked box would have been enough to make anyone inventing algebra. And that, perhaps, is why the myth stuck around. It symbolized the dark artistry people wanted to believe about the Middle Ages, that it was an era so twisted, even furniture wanted to kill you. The Pear of Anguish, a masterclass in unnecessary design. Now, if the Iron Maiden was probably fake, the Pear of Anguish was uncomfortably real and disturbingly elegant in its simplicity. This little device looked like a metallic fruit with 4 curved petals that could be expanded by turning a screw. It was allegedly inserted into a victim's mouth or, in some accounts, other less conversational areas, and then slowly expanded. It didn't always kill, but it sure made life unpleasant. The strange part is how delicate it was. Polished metal, smooth mechanisms, crafted like jewelry. You could almost imagine it being displayed in a glass case at an art museum if you didn't know what it did. It's a reminder that cruelty doesn't always roar. Sometimes it clicks softly, precision-engineered, and disturbingly quiet. The rack, stretching the truth and the body. Of course, no gallery of medieval torment would be complete without the rack, the most iconic device of them all. 2 rollers, a sturdy frame, and ropes tied to wrists and ankles. The executioner would turn the handle, slowly, evenly, stretching the victim's body until joints popped, muscles tore, and the truth, whatever it was, came screaming out. The brilliance of the rack wasn't in its brutality, but in its gradualism. You could increase the tension just a little, enough to make someone talk, or go further if the confessions weren't convincing. It was the physical embodiment of bureaucracy, efficient, procedural, and terrifyingly rational. And yet, in many places, it was used not to kill, but to verify truth. Because, of course, nothing says trustworthy confession like a man whose shoulders are halfway to the ceiling. Executioners often bragged about their touch, how they could extract information without killing. They treated the rack like a musical instrument, priding themselves on their control and rhythm. Which, when you think about it, makes them history's first sadistic sound engineers. The artistry behind agony. By the late medieval period, torture had become so normalized that entire manuals were written on how to perform it properly. Executioners trained apprentices. Cities commissioned new designs. There were even regional preferences. Some favored burning, others breaking, and some, like Italy, preferred devices that blended beauty with horror. Pain wasn't random anymore. It had aesthetic. Even language became elegant about it. Words like questioning, examination, and inquiry replaced torture. Bureaucracy wrapped cruelty in paperwork, and suddenly, what was once barbaric became administrative. The executioner, once an outcast, now became a respected official, a man of skill, hired by law, carrying out the divine will through mechanical precision. And just like that, torture became less about punishment and more about performance. Humanity's quiet talent. If you listen closely through the centuries, you can almost hear the hum of gears, the creak of ropes, the calm, professional footsteps of men who believed they were doing their duty, perfectly, efficiently, without passion. And that's what makes this period so unsettling. Not the blood, not the screams, but the calmness of it all. The way pain was handled like a craft, as if misery were just another trade. In their own strange way, these executioners were engineers of order, shaping fear into obedience, art into authority. And as the Renaissance dawned, that artistry only deepened, because while science began to understand the body, torture was still trying to master the soul. But we'll save that for our next drowsy descent. So take a deep breath, maybe stretch your limbs, gently of course, and settle back in. Because in the next part, we'll wander into the Renaissance of pain itself, when torture became medical, psychological, and disturbingly elegant. Sleep tight. Hey there, sleepless historians. Welcome back to another quiet plunge into humanity's softer side. By which, of course, I mean the precise, intellectual, and deeply unnecessary innovations of Renaissance torture. Because as art, anatomy, and philosophy blossomed under the golden sun of humanism, someone, somewhere, said, you know what would make this cultural awakening even better? Sharper instruments. This was the age when scientists and scholars began poking at the mysteries of the human body, but not always in the cozy, candlelit discovery way. Sometimes that curiosity found its way into the dungeons. The line between anatomy lesson and interrogation session grew so thin that it might as well have been drawn with a quill dipped in blood and irony. So settle in, take a slow breath, because tonight we drift through the age when intellect and pain politely shook hands and decided to collaborate. The anatomical awakening, or when curiosity got creepy. Let's start with the big picture. The Renaissance was obsessed with the body. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci dissected corpses to understand musculature and motion. Scientists like Vesalius mapped the skeleton in loving, meticulous detail. Humanity was suddenly fascinated with what made humans tick. And naturally, the people running torture chambers were paying attention. The newfound knowledge of joints, nerves, and blood flow didn't just help medicine. It made torture more efficient. Why break bones blindly when you could target the exact spots that hurt most without killing too soon? Executioners began learning anatomy, not for healing, but for optimization. Torture, like everything else in the Renaissance, became an art guided by science. It was the dawn of evidence-based cruelty. The strappado, a gravity lesson no one wanted. First on tonight's syllabus is the strappado, a favorite among inquisitors and other upstanding institutions of truth. The design was deceptively simple, just ropes, pulleys, and gravity. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, a rope attached to their wrists, and then hoisted upward. The body's own weight did the rest. Shoulders dislocated, tendons tore, and sometimes the arms twisted backward with an elegant, audible pop. No need for blood, no need for spikes, just geometry and patience. The brilliance and horror of the strappado was its subtlety. You could adjust the height, add weights to the feet, or drop the victim suddenly for a sharp jolt of agony. It was practically physics homework with human bones. And to the Renaissance mind, that was progress. Because nothing said enlightened civilization like replacing crude beatings with a perfectly measured application of tension. The water torture. Science meets drip aesthetics. Next comes the water torture, which sounds like something invented at a spa, but was decidedly not relaxing. In its simplest form, the victim was restrained under a slow, steady drip of cold water landing on the same spot of the forehead, again and again and again. At first, it was just annoying. After hours or days, the body began to revolt. The rhythm disrupted sleep, the nerves overfired, and the mind started fraying. Some prisoners reportedly hallucinated, convinced that the water was burrowing through their skulls. All of this from gravity, water, and time. The Renaissance adored it because it was clean. No blood, no visible wounds, just pure psychological disassembly. You could leave someone completely unmarked and utterly broken. It was cruelty disguised as precision. A beautiful metaphor for the era, really, where intelligence and empathy occasionally forgot to RSV to the same party. The surgical turn, when doctors took notes. Around the same time, medicine and torture began to share vocabulary, observation, procedure, experiment. Executioners consulted physicians for advice on how to prolong consciousness. Doctors, in turn, used condemned prisoners as test subjects. Everyone learned something, except the poor person in the middle. Records from the Spanish Inquisition describe torturers asking physicians whether a victim could endure another round without dying. The answer was often yes. After all, the Renaissance loved endurance. Even public dissections blurred the line. Audiences gathered to watch as the human body was opened, piece by piece, for science or penance, depending on the setting. The same calm detachment that drove anatomical study also fueled the refinement of pain. It wasn't personal, it was educational. And that was perhaps the most chilling development of all. The birth of the idea that suffering could be studied objectively. The chair of interrogation, a seat for scientific conversation. Then there was the interrogation chair, a close cousin of the Judas chair with Renaissance upgrades, iron construction, hundreds of small spikes, and often heat. Yes, they began heating the chair from below with coals, gently warming the metal until it seared the flesh. Slow, even, methodical, no chaos, no shouting, just careful temperature control and deeply unpleasant conversation. One might even call it an early experiment in thermal pain management, if one were being generous. The brilliance here was in combining both physical and mental torment. The prisoner was forced to confess while literally burning, but without the messy unpredictability of flames. It was pain you could regulate, and that, to the Renaissance mind, was almost noble. It wasn't about rage or revenge, it was about procedure. The birth of the professional torturer. By the 1500s, European cities were full of educated executioners, men with apprentices, tools, and reputations to maintain. Some even treated their trade like a guild, passing down secrets of anatomy, metallurgy, and body endurance. They understood muscle fatigue, blood loss rates, and psychological thresholds, all the science of suffering before psychology or medicine had formal names for them. It was efficiency wrapped in ritual, every movement calculated, every breath measured. They took pride in making torture humane, meaning technically survivable, because dead people, after all, couldn't confess. It's a grim paradox, civilization refining the very thing it claimed to rise above. But that's the Renaissance for you, light and darkness in the same gilded frame. The quiet philosophy of pain. If the Middle Ages saw torture as divine punishment, the Renaissance saw it as a mechanism, a tool, a system for finding truth, preserving order, or studying the body's mysteries. It wasn't about wrath anymore, it was about results. Torture had become data collection. And that mindset would linger for centuries. The Enlightenment might have brought philosophy, but it also brought even subtler methods of breaking people: isolation, sensory deprivation, moral guilt. The tools got cleaner, the goals stayed the same. Because once humanity learns how to make suffering systematic, it doesn't easily forget. So, as we drift toward the end of this long, miserable bedtime story, remember this. Pain has always followed progress, wearing different costumes, speaking new languages, pretending to be justified. The Renaissance didn't end torture, it just gave it better lighting and a Latin name. Now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop. You've survived another quiet hour of human history's least charming side. Next time, we'll close this series with one final descent into the age when torture became modern, hidden behind walls, laws, and euphemisms. Because, of course, progress never really meant mercy. Hey there, Night Wanderer! If you're still awake, congratulations! You've officially outlasted the Middle Ages, the Inquisition, and the Renaissance. That's more than most people in those centuries could say. Tonight, we're drifting into the quieter, colder side of pain, the modern era. The age when dungeons went out of fashion and laboratories moved in. When torture learned to hide its face, wear a uniform, and call itself something respectable, like interrogation technique. Because, as it turns out, humanity didn't stop torturing people. We just got better lighting, better paperwork, and better excuses. So, tuck in, let's float through the centuries when misery became modern, standardized, sanitized, and somehow even more unsettling. From dungeon to desk. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe began to pat itself on the back for being enlightened. Torture was officially abolished in many countries. And by abolished, I mean rebranded. The public racks and whips disappeared, yes, but behind closed doors, the spirit of the dungeon lived on, in prisons, workhouses, and laboratories. Now, pain wasn't a spectacle, it was a procedure. Quiet, clinical, done by men in coats instead of men with hoods. Documents replaced screams. Ledgers replaced chains. And somewhere, someone decided that if you record suffering in Latin, it counts as progress. The chair evolves. Welcome to the electric age. If the medievals had the spiked chair, the moderns had the electric chair, a device so proud of its innovation that it called itself humane. Invented in the late 19th century as a scientific alternative to hanging, it was meant to kill quickly, efficiently, and with less mess. Spoiler, it didn't. Early executions often took multiple shocks. Skin burned, smoke filled the air, and sometimes the body caught fire. But the audience, now smaller, more civilized, still came to watch. The irony was sharp. The same century that brought us light bulbs and telegraphs also introduced a new, electrically powered way to end life. Thomas Edison himself endorsed it as a humane method, as if plugging someone into the grid was an act of progress. The Middle Ages had spectacle. The modern world had marketing. The birth of psychological torture, cruelty without the blood. By the 20th century, physical torture started to look old-fashioned. Governments, militaries, and intelligence agencies turned their attention to the mind. Why break the body when you can break the spirit? Interrogators began experimenting with psychological pain, sensory deprivation, isolation, humiliation, and sleep deprivation. The tools were cleaner, quieter, and disturbingly invisible. Rooms were kept cold. Lights stayed on for days. Victims were told nothing. No clocks, no noise, no contact, just silence and time. This was the new science of suffering, pain without scars. The Renaissance gave us anatomy. The modern age gave us psychology and found new ways to twist it. The laboratory era, when ethics became optional. The 20th century also witnessed a darker evolution when experiments blurred into torture. During wartime, doctors and scientists performed unspeakable studies on prisoners, all in the name of knowledge. Freezing experiments, poison gas, disease testing, the lab coat became the new cloak of cruelty. And afterward, many of those techniques didn't vanish. They quietly migrated into military intelligence, interrogation handbooks, and national security manuals. Pain had gone professional. Now it spoke in terms like stress position, enhanced technique, and psychological leverage. It all sounded very clean, which, in a way, was the point. Civilization doesn't destroy cruelty, it bureaucratizes it. The paperwork of pain. If medieval torture was a scream in a dungeon, modern torture is a whisper in a meeting room. Forms are filled, memos are approved, legal frameworks are drafted to make suffering technically compliant with human rights, as long as you call it something else. We stopped swinging axes, but we perfected the memo. We stopped building racks, but we built procedures. It's progress, just with better fonts. The cold efficiency of silence. There's something uniquely haunting about how quiet modern torture became. No crowds, no pyres, no grand declarations. Just silence. Just rooms. Just people doing their jobs. The same detachment that once powered the Renaissance workshop now hums through modern institutions, calm, professional, and entirely sure of its necessity. The torturer no longer sees himself as cruel. He's simply efficient. And efficiency, after all, is one of civilization's favorite virtues. The mirror test. If there's one lesson running through every era, from racks to research, it's that cruelty always finds a way to look respectable. In the medieval age, it wore the cross. In the Renaissance, it wore reason. In the modern world, it wears the flag, or the logo, or the lab coat. But it's still the same creature, just more organized. And that's why this entire sleepy stroll through history is so strange. Because the more we advance, the more inventive we become at hiding what we can't bear to admit, that the instinct to dominate, to control, to correct, never really left us. It just learned to keep quiet. The Middle Ages had spectacle. The modern world had marketing. The end of the line, sort of. So here we are, centuries later, surrounded by comfort and technology, still haunted by the same old impulses. We can call it interrogation, or experimentation, or deterrence. We can bury it under law, or reason, or fear. But in the end, it's the same whisper from the dark corners of human history. The quiet fascination with what a body and a mind can endure. And maybe that's why these stories still keep us awake. Not because of the blood or the pain, but because, deep down, they sound too familiar. So, dim the lights. Let the past settle in. Because if there's one thing history teaches, it's that progress doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it just changes uniforms. Sleep well, night scholar. You've reached humanity's most uncomfortable lullaby. So, here we are. At the quiet, uncomfortable end of this long, meandering tour through human creativity's most questionable chapter. You've made it through racks, boots, branks, donkeys, wheels, spiders, and chairs that make IKEA furniture look like divine mercy. And you're still awake? Well, congratulations. You're either a historian or mildly concerning. But let's ease out of the dungeon, slowly, quietly, as the torches flicker behind us and the echo of dripping water fades away. The medieval torture chamber, that morbid stage of iron and imagination, didn't vanish overnight. It simply evolved, refined itself, hid behind legal systems and justice. Because, of course, humanity never really stops experimenting with pain. It just rebrands it. Let's think about that for a second. The same hands that built soaring cathedrals also engineered crushing wheels. The same era that painted angels on chapel ceilings also drew diagrams of how to dislocate every joint in a body. There's something tragically poetic about it, in a very please don't invite them to dinner sort of way. Pain, it seems, was both punishment and performance. Kings and inquisitors justified it as divine purification, while peasants whispered that it was entertainment for the bored and powerful. Some torturers even signed their work, like artists, crafted this fine Iron Maiden, 1536, a calling card of cruelty. And yet, it's hard not to sense the weird intimacy of it all. Torture was, in a grim way, an art of attention. Every lever, spike, and screw was made for someone's body, measured, tested, perfected. The medieval world didn't just punish the wicked, it studied them. It documented their screams like scholars taking notes at a lecture. The line between punishment and obsession blurred until it was almost indistinguishable. Of course, we can sit here centuries later, comfortably smug in our candle-scented modern morality, and pretend we're better. But scroll through history's later chapters and you'll find the same mechanics, only cleaner, quieter, dressed up in lab coats instead of leather aprons. The Age of Enlightenment was very enlightened, until someone needed a confession. So perhaps the real torture device isn't the wheel or the rack, it's the human imagination itself, a thing so endlessly creative it can design both a violin and a breaking wheel, both a chapel and an Iron Maiden. Let's drift on that thought a moment longer. Imagine the last executioner, standing in his cold chamber as progress finally catches up to him. His tools rust, his ropes fray, the nobles stop calling, the Inquisition closes shop. He looks around at his work, these beautiful, horrible machines, and wonders what to do now. Maybe he sighs. Maybe he misses the sound of the chains. Maybe he opens a bakery. You never know. But his legacy lingers. The same fascination with pain, how it looks, how it feels, how it can be controlled, runs through our movies, our prisons, our politics. We just call it something else now. And so the next time you walk through a museum and see a spiked chair behind glass, just remember, it wasn't some monstrous alien civilization that built that. It was us, with our opposable thumbs and our bright ideas and our eternal curiosity about how far the human body can bend before it breaks. The medieval world didn't invent cruelty, it just made it artisanal. Now the torches dim, the chains stop rattling, the air grows still. Let's leave the dungeon doors closed behind us tonight. We've seen enough iron for one lifetime. Sleep well, my fellow historian, and if you hear faint clanking in your dreams, don't worry, it's probably just history getting comfortable again. Good night.